Hey, it's Steve, and this is the long overdue part 3 in a 4-part series on building this 3.5 by 5.5 foot end scale project layout. If you haven't seen the first 2 parts in this series, here is a look at the track plan I am using for this layout, which has been built using Kato Unitrack. You can check out the link in the description below to the website page that shows the details of the track plan if you are interested in a parts list. Before we get started going through how I built everything since the last video, let's do a quick recap. The frame of this layout has been built using pine and is sized to just fit into the back of my Toyota RAV4, so that's the reason for the 3.5 by 5.5 foot size. Much of the layout has been built using extruded insulation foam board, which allows for easy elevation changes on the layout and provides for easy scenery construction. Sculptamold was used for much of the final scenery cover since it is easy to work with and it is cheap when you buy it in bulk. You can buy it in 25 and 50 pound sacks, which are dramatically cheaper per pound than the small bags you find in your local craft store. The layout was wired with a Digitrax DCC system with push buttons on the layout fascia that control each of the 6 turnouts and crossovers, as well as toggle switches for lights and other accessories. I also eventually swapped out the wooden legs for some sturdy powder-coated metal legs, which I think look great with the cherry stained wood and really do add a lot of stability to the layout. Alright, now for the new progress since the last full update video on this project layout. So once all the wiring was done, I moved on to weathering all of the Unitrack. While the Kato track is super reliable and extremely easy to use, the Code 80 rail is way oversized for end scale, so weathering the rail doesn't just help the color look more realistic, but by also darkening the rail it helps to hide the overall height of the rail to some extent as well. I used the Woodland Scenics Tidy Track Painter pens for this project, and I used the steel rail color for the rail itself. First off, when opening the package up, note that you do get an extra brush tip for the paint pen, and you do not want to lose that since you will need it. In fact, you're actually going to need about 10 more of those, but they only give you the one. So do make sure you do keep that extra tip. To start using the pens, you need to shake the pen well for a minute or so, and then depress the tip several times on a hard surface to get the paint flowing through the brush tip. Then you can run the brush tip along the side of the rail. I found that one pass wouldn't put enough paint on the rail, and so I had to often make 2 or 3 passes to get the rail fully coated. These brush tips are also less durable than other similar paint pens I've used before, and so after doing just one section of track, the brush tip was already kind of torn up a bit from the spike heads on the track. And you can carefully trim the tips a little bit once or so before you try to replace it, or you could try flipping the brush tip around, pulling it out, putting it back in the other way, and then trimming the tip on the other side, and maybe get a few uses out of that one, but you are going to need to swap it out with a new tip once it becomes too worn, which does happen unfortunately very, very quickly. For the turnouts and crossovers, I used Neolube on the points and frogs and other areas that I wanted to darken but didn't want to lose electrical conductivity. Neolube is essentially a powdered graphite type mix in alcohol that can be painted onto the surface. It adheres well and can be used on your locomotive wheels and other metal surfaces that you want to darken. The Neolube really helps to make turnouts and crossovers look more realistic by toning down the bright shiny rails, hinges, and other parts of the turnout, and you're not going to lose electrical conductivity anywhere that you put it. I still use the paint pens on the outside of the rails and in areas where electrical conductivity wasn't an issue, and then cleaned off the tops of the rail before the paint fully dried. You can see here the difference between the painted and unpainted rail. The top section of track has had the rail painted, while the bottom section is still unpainted. The top section does have wood ties and the bottom section does have concrete ties, so the track itself does look different too, but note how the bright shiny rail has been transformed into something that looks at least more realistic, and it does not look quite as large either from a distance. Since the brush tips of the pens gave out really quick, well before the paint in the pen did, I switched to just painting the rail with a brush. I pulled the brush tip out of the pen and then shook the paint out into a cup, and you might have to poke a nail or a small screwdriver up into the paint pen to help the paint flow out a lot easier. But just painting the rail with a brush ended up being a lot easier in the end than using the paint markers since the brush tips gave out so quickly. I also used the weathered tie paint pen to paint some of the track ties, and that worked really well. The pens worked well in this application, and I went around the layout painting various ties with the pens, so there was some variation in track tie color. When it dries, the color difference is subtle, but it does add one more level of realism after the track has been ballasted. If you plan to use the Kato Unitrack as it is without adding ballast, then I would just skip that step since you are going to get paints on all the plastic ballast between the ties. Next, I mixed up a ballast blend to use on this layout. I picked up several bags of the Kato ballast, which does closely match the track bed color, and you can use that right out of the bag and just run it along the edges of the roadbed to help soften those sharp lines along the roadbed edge and have a much better looking layout without fully ballasting the track. However, I like to fully ballast the track on layouts, and I didn't like the color as is out of the bag. So I dumped all the bags of ballast into a larger bag, added various weathering powders to the mix along with another brand of ballast that I had laying around, and I mixed all that up and had a blend that was a little bit more pleasing to my eye than the brighter looking ballast right out of the bag from Kato. So I could finish off the mountain area. The first areas of track that I ballasted were the 2 tunnels. You don't really need to ballast everything inside of a tunnel like this, but if I run a camera on a train through the tunnel, I want it to look good. I like to start out by painting full-strength PVA type glue along the edge of the roadbed, as well as along either side of it. I also painted a strip of glue in between each of the 2 tracks. Putting a layer of glue down first helps to ensure that the ballast will adhere well to the track and layout base and will be less likely to crumble off at some point in the future. After I had the glue in place, I used a small paper cup to pour ballast on either side of each track section, and then a brush to smooth out the ballast to my liking. I sprayed sections of ballast down with alcohol and then dribbled on diluted matte medium with a pipette. It is important to soak the ballast thoroughly with the glue mix so you don't end up with layers of ballast in between the bottom and top layers that are still loose, which could result in parts of your ballast working loose or breaking off it with time. I also ballasted a section of track outside of a tunnel on the lower loop at this point using the same techniques. After making sure I could reach both tunnels from the access hole on the side of the layout, I test fit the top of the mountain over the tunnel areas and trimmed off a few areas of excess foam. Then I applied excessive amounts of glue everywhere and attached the top of the mountain, using some nails to help hold everything in place while the glue dried. I glued in scrap pieces of foam to help fill in some of the gaps, and then mixed up a big batch of Sculptamold so I could cover all of the remaining foam areas on top of the mountain. It turned out that I mixed up way too much at one time and couldn't apply all of it before it began to harden on me. So I ended up having to toss half the mixture out and mix up a second batch to finish the job. And the Sculptamold was fully dry after a few days later, and it does take longer to fully dry than regular plaster, especially when the humidity is high. I painted everything with a brown wash made from about 20% brown paint and 80% water. The thin paint can easily soak into the various grooves and cracks in the Sculptamold and tends to pool in those areas as well, creating variation in the shade of the color. I also test fit a Woodland Scenics plaster tunnel portal in one spot, but quickly realized that it was not going to provide the needed clearance on each side nor on top without a fair bit of modification. So I held off installing any tunnel portals for quite a while to kind of think about the best solution for those areas. Next, I painted on a darker paint wash on the landscape to help provide some additional variation and contrast to the ground and rock areas. And since the main industry is more than an inch lower than the central town area, I decided to build a retaining wall to allow me to expand the central town area a bit more. I made the retaining wall using some large strips of sheet styrene that were cut to height of the wall that I needed, and then I glued those together using some splice plates on the back side of the wall. I then cut several narrow strips that I glued onto the wall for more detail. I glued one strip along the top of the wall, then vertical strips every couple of inches. I test fit the wall on the layout, and then after painting the wall a concrete color, I pinned it in place with some nails, and then applied a thick bead of glue along the back edge of the wall. Since some of the glue was oozing out underneath the wall, I poured some dirt on the front side to kind of help absorb that glue and to cover just the signs of the glue seepage. At this point, I shifted gears to installing some track signals. I picked up some signals from Stuff for Trains and decided to install them in the location you see here. I should note at this point that some people have had issues getting orders filled from Stuff lately, so I have a link below in the description, but you might want to kind of try and contact them first before placing any orders to see if you can get an update or just get some information on their current status. I don't receive any commission or anything from them, but I do like their signals, and it has been a nice addition to this layout. Since the signals were an afterthought, there were only a handful of locations I could put them because the existing scenery and wiring underneath the layout was already in place, and I didn't want to have to disrupt or move anything that was already glued or screwed onto the bottom of the layout. So the locations I picked were basically just those where they wouldn't interfere with existing work on the bottom of the layout. I have a separate video on these signals, so I won't go into the full detail here, but these signals have built-in IR sensors and transmitters, and the whole electronic circuit board is mounted on the bottom of the signal. So you do need to drill a pretty large 3/4 inch diameter hole to accommodate that circuit board built into the base of the signal units. I did just that on each side of the track, and after soldering on some longer wires to the included ones, I installed the signals on the layout. The signals do have a sensitivity adjustment screw, so you do need to make sure you have the adjustment set properly before securing that signal to the layout. If the signal is too sensitive, trains on the opposite track will trip the signal, and if it's not sensitive enough, obviously a train on the track the signal is placed next to won't actually trip the signal either. So how close or far from the track the signal is placed will of course play a role in how you have to have that sensitivity adjustment screw changed. If you just want the signals to operate independently, all you need to do is hook up the two power wires to a power source and you're good to go. But you can also daisy chain them together so multiple signals will work together, or install additional sensors for the crossing signals and so forth to trip them from a different location. If you just connect the power, the track signals will turn red when a train passes, and then after 8 seconds it will turn to yellow and then to green after another 8 seconds. If connected to additional signals, the color changes will be controlled based on the signals down the line, so a signal won't turn from yellow to green, for example, until the next signal turns from red to yellow. While waiting for my second order of signals to arrive, I went back to working on the layout scenery. I decided I didn't really like the original waterfall river area, and so I raised up part of it with a layer of 1-inch foam. I glued and nailed the foam down and then spread some Sculptamold around the foam edges to blend those into the surrounding scenery, and I also built a base area for a hotel out of styrene that will overlook the eventual lake and waterfall. I spread Sculptamold around that area as well. For the front of the lake area, I built up a dam made out of the Sculptamold that extends about 1 centimeter or so above the front edge of the lake. This way I'll be able to pour a lake of resin and it won't simply flow, off the edge and downstream. There will then be a waterfall at that front of the lake area that flows down into the river under the two bridges at the front of the layout. Next, I worked on the front right section of the layout. There's going to be a small industry there, and I wanted to have the track embedded in concrete in this area. So I built most of the base area out of styrene, but decided to fill the space in between the rails with plaster instead of styrene, mainly because there was a curve in the track there. I simply used some regular drywall spackle to fill the area between the rails, and this type is pink out of the pail, but it does turn white when dry. I spread it out smoothly and then cut grooves along the sides of each rail. And once everything was dry, I spray painted everything with a concrete color. I worked on a bit more scenery in the left front area of the layout, putting down some static grass and ground foam, and then it was time to finally install the tunnel portals. I found a tunnel portal design online that I thought would work well, and then I edited the design to be a bit larger in width and height to meet the clearance needs that I had on this layout. I printed out 4 of the tunnel portals with my 3D printer, and then cut away scenery as needed to get the tunnel portals to fit in each location. After painting the tunnel portals with spray paint and applying a black wash and some weathering powders, I glued them in place with wood glue and a few spots of hot glue. On the back of the layout, the 2 tunnel openings are too close together for the tunnel portals to work as they were, so I had to cut one side of each tunnel portal off and then glue those together, and then I put a brick column in between to hide the seam. The completed unit was then glued in place the same way using wood glue and hot glue as I did for the front 2 tunnel portals. I mixed up a small batch of Sculptamold to blend in the tunnel portals to the surrounding scenery, and making sure I kept the cup containing it right in front of the camera so you couldn't see how I did it. But here you can see how they looked after being blended into the surrounding rockwork, but before I actually painted that area of Sculptamold. It was then time to finish up more of the passenger station at the front of the layout. I wanted to have a platform on the other side of the tracks from the station, along with a walkway that crossed the tracks. So I cut some pieces of styrene to fashion a walkway across the tracks, and then I built up a platform on the other side by simply stacking up pieces of styrene until I had the height that I wanted. I glued that in place, and while the glue was drying, I patched a few gaps between the track and surrounding scenery with more of the patching plaster. And then once that was in place, I could ballast the track on that part of the layout using the same techniques I showed before. I continued around the layout and ballasted more of the back side of the layout, and then started working on installing some of the structures. I drilled a hole for the LED wires in the warehouse structure, fed those wires through, and then glued the warehouse in place. I drilled a hole for the hotel lighting, and then started working on preparing the roadways through the central town area. Since I used Woodland Scenic Smooth It for most of the road areas, I masked off all the areas I didn't want to get covered in plaster, and then I mixed up a batch of Smooth It plaster using some black India ink for some color so it wouldn't dry a pure white. I poured out the plaster and worked it around using scrap pieces of styrene as spreaders, and then when the plaster was starting to set a bit, I pulled up the masking tape and then continued to work the plaster smooth the best I could. As it began to set, I kind of switched to smoothing things with my finger, and then once it was fully dry, I used a sanding sponge to get me an even smoother initial road surface. Even so, there were still plenty of imperfections, and so I mixed up another small batch of Smooth It and spread that around the road areas. And then with this batch, I pretty much just scraped the plaster onto the existing road base, trying to fill in all the little gaps and dips and get things as smooth as possible. After another sanding and some cleanup in places with a knife, things were pretty much ready to go. I placed the gas station on the layout, which was built from a Walthers kit, and traced around the base sections with a knife, and then came back and scraped away the plaster from those areas that the gas station base would be sitting in. And then after a good vacuum, I was able to glue down a couple of the base pieces for the gas station. Before I went any further, I realized that was probably a good place to stop and start painting the road areas, and so I masked off everything that wasn't road and sprayed a few colors of gray spray paint on the roadway areas. The various colors create some variation in texture and shading to the road areas that makes it look a little bit more realistic than one uniform color. I'll eventually come back and hit the road areas with some weathering powders and washes, but I was ready to move on with more structure installation at that point. So I drilled 2 holes for the gas station lights, one where the pumps were located and one where the gas station convenience store was located. I had to drill these kind of at an angle so I wouldn't drill down into the Digitrax DCC switch machine controls that were installed directly under that location. I then glued down the gas station pump section and glued down the passenger station. I wanted to have the interiors on some of the structures visible, and so I picked up a Rumettes kit to add those interior details. I do have a video on using those Rumettes kits, and so check that out if you want to learn more about them. So I won't go into full detail here, but these are simple cardstock kits that you fold up into rooms that can be glued inside your structures. They include LED lights that are compatible with the Just Plug system, and an opening in the ceiling of each room where you can put those lights. While just cardstock printouts, the kits really do make the structure interiors look a lot nicer and are especially interesting to see at night when lighted. With those interiors installed, I was able to glue down the gas station and then drill holes for the other structures in the town area. 3 of the structures were pre-built Woodland Scenic structures that had lights already installed, and the other one was built from one of the kits included in the Woodland Scenic's town and industry kit that they put together to work with their 3x6 foot N-scale layout kit they offer. After drilling holes for the structure lights through a styrene sidewalk base, I realized I probably should have installed the street lights into that sidewalk base before gluing it down to the layout. So I ripped up the styrene sidewalk and drilled small holes for the Woodland Scenic streetlights I used, and then since the wires were small, I simply taped them to a pencil and dropped them through the holes so I could easily pull the wires through. Then I glued the sidewalk and building base back down to the layout, and while that was drying, I drilled a hole for the IR sensor I was going to install for the crossing lights. I also added a couple more lights to the station area and then glued down the remaining structures using super glue. I weighted down each of the structures while the glue dried to make sure they were being bonded to the base well. Wiring up all the lights was a pain and it took quite a long time, but the effort was worth it. Since the street lights and other small LED lights use very thin wire, if you do decide to cut the wire to length, you need to strip off the coating in some way. And while you can try to strip it off with a knife or wire strippers, you probably won't have a lot of success because the wire is just extremely thin and easy to break. So the easy way is to take a lighter and simply burn off the coating on the ends of each of those wires. That works great, and it's far easier than trying to manually strip the coating off. You can see here what some of those lit building interiors look like using the Roomettes kits. It is hard to tell in scale that everything is just two-dimensional, and at any rate, it looks a lot better than just simply seeing a blank interior. The hotel and warehouse don't have any detailed interiors, and if I had more time to spend on this project, it would have been nice to try to produce detailed interiors for those, but being larger structures, it would just take a lot more time and effort. I mentioned that the Z-Stuff signals can be somewhat problematic to get a hold of, and the second order of signals took almost 2 months to arrive after I ordered them. But they finally did arrive, and you can see them all here with extension wires soldered on. I had to find different locations for these on the layout that didn't interfere with the existing wiring under the layout, so the locations weren't ideal, but worked well enough for this layout. The layout isn't signaled prototypically, but the signals still add a lot of interest to the layout. I drilled the needed holes, glued the signals in place, and then scenicked around them. I initially wired the signals all together so they would be all daisy-chained and kind of work prototypically in terms of their progression of lights, but it didn't really work out quite that well because of the small layout size. Since I only had 3 sets of signals, you could only get the proper changing from red to yellow to green if the train length was just right and the train speed was just right. Connecting them all together would work better in a larger layout with more sets of signals and just overall more space between them. So I went back to just having each signal on a time delay. The effect is similar and it works regardless of train length or speed, though you can still run a long train around the layout fast enough to prevent a signal from ever turning to green, since the layout just isn't that big. Just using the time delay makes the wiring a lot easier though, since all you have to do is connect each of them to power. I installed a couple sets of terminal strips under the layout to connect all the signals to, and then I have those terminal strips in turn connected to one of the toggle switches on the front of the layout so they can be turned on or off. I also have a sound unit connected to the crossing signals glued to the underside of the layout, and that sound unit is connected to its own toggle switch so you can keep the sound off but keep the signals on. And the reality is, while the crossing bell signal sound is nice to have, in practice you probably aren't going to want to hear it all the time since it can get kind of annoying after it's been going for a while. With all but one of the structures in place and all the signals in place and wired up under the layout, I could turn most of my attention back to scenery work. I glued some JTT wire trees in a row along the gas station area where I had made a little narrow strip of grass between the road and the gas station, and these trees are really nice in that they are all very durable, made from just twisted wire. I next touched up the paint in various areas and then tackled the base scenery on the mountain. I painted everything with a layer of full-strength white glue and then spread on a layer of dirt. This is a dirt ballast mix from Scenic Express, and it contains everything from finely sifted dirt to small rocks. And that works really well for a scenery base like this, as the heavier and larger particles kind of tend to roll all down to the lower areas, which is what you would actually see in nature as well. I rubbed the dirt into the rocks as well in places to help kind of blend the colors together, and then also piled up some Woodland Scenics talus around the waterfall area and sides of the upper river. I covered the talus with more of a dirt to kind of make it look more embedded into the ground and not just sitting on top of it. Once everything looked good, I sprayed down one section at a time with alcohol and then dribbled on diluted matte medium. I really soaked the deeper piles of dirt and talus to make sure it was all bonded really well to the layout. I also glued down dirt and rocks to the base of the lake and river itself, and while the glue was still wet, I applied a layer of static grass on the top of the mountain as well at that time. I then repeated the same process to the remaining areas of the layout that didn't have any scenery in place to that point. I had one more structure to build for the layout, and this one was a Pikestuff distribution center kit. I had never actually built a Pikestuff kit before, and that's kind of amazing considering how many of those are out there available to be used in both N and HO scale. And I really liked the kit. It was easy to build, and since all the windows and doors are applied separately, it is easy to paint everything well and have it look good when you build it. I assembled the walls and roof pieces, painted those, and then painted all the windows and doors while they were still attached to the sprues. Then it was just a matter of cutting those out and gluing them in place. And for the big doors, I wanted to have those open so rail cars could pass through the structure, and so I just cut off a small sliver of each of those doors and glued it to the very top of the opening. I glued the structure to the layout in the right front corner and then piled some dirt and static grass around the edges where it met the layout to hide any of the seams. I wanted the whole area fenced off, and so I used more of the Woodland Scenics chain link fencing that I've used on previous projects. These aren't quite as realistic as some of the other kits that are available out there, but they are far easier to install and they're pretty durable, and so you can get a better looking end result with these in many cases, rather than using a more finely detailed but also much more delicate option that you might end up mangling halfway through the installation. I used a drill bit in my pin vise that was just slightly larger than the post size on the fence sections, and then I drilled holes for each of the posts and glued down one section at a time with super glue. I applied glue to the posts as well as to the bottom edge of each fence section and whatever edge was meeting up with an adjoining fence section. Installation goes fast and easy, and I also made some gates that swing open across the track. I simply took a couple of fence sections with posts and found some aluminum tubing in my scrap box that was just the right size for the posts. I glued the tubes into the layout base, and then I simply have the fence post sitting in the tubing. This way you can gently open and close the gates when you switch cars into the industry, and those might get broken over time, so I'll make sure I have a few extra additional gate sections available and ready to go if needed. I also added fencing around the parking lot of the large warehouse, as well as along the edge of what will be a parking area by the passenger station. Next up was a cell phone tower. I found a BLMA cell phone model kit that I had never built in my scrap box, and so I built that easy to assemble kit and found an open spot behind the structures to place it. I fenced off an area and then made a hole in the base to glue the cell phone tower itself into, and I also added some aluminum tubing and a ladder on the BLMA kit as well, so it looks a little bit more realistic. I'll have to find a large electrical box or shed at some point as well to put next to the tower inside the fenced area to kind of complete that overall scene. At this point, I started making some of the super trees I plan to use for most of the forested areas on the layout. I basically just took sections of super tree material, spray painted those a camo brown color, and I'll eventually come back and hit these with a bit of light gray as well before adding the flocking. However, before completing the trees, I needed to add more ground cover. Since this will be a fall-themed layout, I needed to have lots of leaves and twigs and such things on the ground around the trees, and so I simply mixed up a batch of the various ground foams I plan to use on the trees, some dead vines I kind of chopped up to look like little branches, and some brown ground foam to look like dead leaves or undergrowth, and whatever little bits of stuff I could find that looked like they might work out. I just mixed up whatever I thought would look reasonable to see on the forest floor into a cup. Then I sprayed various sections of the layout with some alcohol first, since I figured the material would kind of stick a little bit better to a damp surface than a dry one. I sprinkled on the mix, and then I sprayed it down with some diluted matte medium with an old sprayer that didn't really work well, and just kind of dribbled all the glue out in kind of a mess all over, but it worked well enough. Then I sprayed a bit more alcohol on each area to help that glue spread out better and soak into the flocking mix, and then I sprinkled down a little bit more of that mix on top to soak up any extra glue. I did the same process for the remainder of the layout and have what you see here. I think it looks pretty reasonable, and it will look a lot better once I do have everything covered with a dense covering of fall colored trees. But I think this video has gone on long enough, and probably too long, but I kept working on the layout as I was editing the 25 hours of video that went into this episode, and so I kept adding more and more video to the end of the project. But anyway, in the fourth and final video of this series, I'll get all the trees produced and installed and finish up the remaining layout details. I'll do some additional work on the sides of the layout above the wood frame to get those looking a little bit nicer. I'll clean up the wiring under the layout a bit, and I'll also add a covering to the bottom of the layout to help protect that wiring, and also maybe add a removable backdrop. And generally, I'll just try to get the layout project wrapped up. So look for that next video later this fall. Anyway, that's all for this video, and thanks for watching. Bye.